You are lying in the dark right now, phone in hand, and something in you already knows this is wrong. Not morally wrong. Not the wrong of a person who has failed some test of willpower or discipline or personal virtue. The wrong of a system working exactly as designed, a system that spent enormous resources figuring out how to keep you in precisely this position, at precisely this hour, in precisely this state of tired but unable to stop. The notification that pulled you out of the first stage of sleep, the thumbnail you clicked instead of closing your eyes, the video that started before you made a conscious decision to watch it, the feed that never ends because ending is the one thing it was specifically designed never to do. You are awake. Someone, somewhere, is pleased about this. I want to be honest with you before we go any further, because this is the kind of conversation that requires honesty about its own conditions to be worth having at all. This channel, Aphelion, is not currently monetized. It does not run ads, but I want you to understand what that means in concrete terms, not as a performance of virtue, but because the numbers are part of the story. If this channel were monetized and the infrastructure is already in place, the decision not to run ads is a choice made inside a system that is designed to encourage the opposite choice. I would earn somewhere between $1,500 and $4,000 for every 100,000 views this video receives. The range is wide because YouTube's payment system depends on who is watching, where they are watching from, and what advertisers are willing to pay to reach that particular demographic at that particular moment. For 1 million views, the range would be between $15,000 and $40,000. These are not hypothetical numbers. They are the actual economics of the platform you are using right now, and they are the economics that structure almost everything you watch on it. I'm telling you this because this video is about the economics of your attention, and it would be dishonest to discuss that economics while pretending that this video exists outside it. It does not. This video lives on YouTube, which is owned by Google, which is the largest advertising company in human history. The algorithm that decided to show you this particular video made a calculation about your particular attention, what kind of content you engage with, how long you watch, what you click on in the moments after watching, and it offered you this because its model predicted you would find it worth your time. The fact that you're still here means the model was correct. The fact that you keep watching, if you do, will teach the algorithm something it will use to make the next prediction slightly more accurate. The machine learns from you even when it is teaching you about the machine. This is the paradox we are going to inhabit for the next hour or so. Not resolve, not escape from, just look at directly, which is already different from what most content on this platform invites you to do. But before we go deeper, if these long, unhurried explorations of ideas that matter help you think more clearly or sleep a little more honestly, please like this video and subscribe to Aphelion. I know the irony of making this request in the middle of a discussion about the attention economy. I am aware of it, and I'm making the request anyway, because this is how the platform works, and because it genuinely helps other people who are lying awake with the same questions find their way here. If you feel like it, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I find these things genuinely moving. There is something I cannot quite explain about the idea that at this specific hour, in so many different time zones, strangers are lying in the dark wondering about the same things. That the questions that feel most private, why can't I sleep? What am I doing with my time? Whose life am I actually living? Turn out to be the questions that connect us most reliably across the distances. And now let us begin. There is a statistic that surfaces periodically in discussions about sleep and technology, circulates widely for a few days, generates some concerned op-eds, and then sinks back into the general noise of information. The statistic is this: Americans now sleep, on average, between 6.5 and 7 hours per night. In 1942, the average was closer to 8. The shift began slowly in the post-war decades and then accelerated, sharply, measurably, in a way that correlates with specific technological introductions, in the years after the smartphone became something that most adults carried with them through every waking hour. We lost, by this measure, somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes of sleep over the course of 80 years. And within that general trend, there are subpopulations, teenagers, young adults, people who work in knowledge industries, people in certain countries who have lost considerably more. This sounds like a public health story. It is a public health story, but it is also a story about money, which is not usually the framing that sleep researchers use when they publish in journals, because sleep researchers are not primarily thinking about money when they study sleep. They are thinking about adenosine and cortisol and circadian rhythms. They are thinking about hippocampal memory consolidation and prefrontal glucose metabolism and what happens to immune function after a week of restriction to 6 hours. They are thinking, in other words, about the biological machinery of rest and about the consequences when that machinery is chronically under-resourced. The people who are thinking about money when they think about your sleep are in different buildings, in different cities, and they are not researchers. They are product managers and algorithm engineers and advertising executives and engagement strategists. And what they have figured out, not through any single deliberate decision, but through the relentless optimization pressure of quarterly earnings reports and daily active user metrics and watch time dashboards, is that the hour you spend asleep is the hour they cannot reach you. Every hour of sleep is a lost opportunity for a served ad. Every time you put down the phone and close your eyes, a metric somewhere fails to tick upward. Every morning you wake up rested and uninterested in immediately checking your notifications represents, in aggregate, a marginal reduction in the engagement numbers that determine the value of the company. And over the decades that this realization has been quietly structuring the design of the technologies that fill our evenings and occupy our beds. The cumulative result is the lost hour, possibly the lost 90 minutes. Possibly, for some people, teenagers especially, the lost decade of development during which the brain was supposed to be doing certain things during sleep that it is now not getting enough time to do. This is not a conspiracy. No one held a secret meeting in which the decision was made to steal your sleep. No executive wrote a memo titled "How to Extend the Waking Hours of Our Users" for commercial benefit. The process is more impersonal than conspiracy, and therefore more difficult to resist, because conspiracy has identifiable perpetrators who can be confronted, while impersonal optimization has only a logic that distributes responsibility across thousands of decisions made by people who were each, individually, just doing their jobs. The system was not designed to destroy your sleep. It was designed to maximize engagement. Destroying your sleep was a side effect of maximizing engagement, and the side effect was noticed by researchers before it was acknowledged by the companies, and it has been inadequately addressed since the acknowledgement arrived. This is the shape of the problem. It is not a dramatic shape. It does not have a villain you can point at. It has a structure that produces villain-shaped outcomes while distributing the agency that would produce a villain across so many people and decisions and quarterly targets that no one individual bears the weight of it. To understand how the machinery works at its most fundamental level, you need to go back to a laboratory at Harvard in the 1930s, where a psychologist named B.F. Skinner was doing experiments that would turn out to be, entirely accidentally, a blueprint for the architecture of the thing you are holding in your hand right now. Skinner was interested in the fundamental question of how behavior is shaped by its consequences. He built boxes. They are still called Skinner boxes in every introductory psychology textbook, in which a rat or a pigeon could press a lever or peck a key to receive a small pellet of food. And then he varied the schedule on which the food appeared. Sometimes he made it predictable. Press the lever, get food, every time, without exception. This is called a fixed ratio schedule, and it produces predictable behavior. The animal learns quickly that the lever delivers food, develops a reliable pattern of pressing it when hungry, and does not develop any particular compulsiveness about it. The behavior is functional. It serves the animal's needs. It stops when the animal is not hungry. Sometimes Skinner made the schedule random. Press the lever, and sometimes you get food, and sometimes you get nothing. And the interval between rewards is unpredictable in a way the animal cannot learn to anticipate. This is called a variable ratio schedule, and the behavior it produces is qualitatively different. The animal presses more. The animal presses persistently even when no food has come for many presses. The animal, observed from outside, looks less like a creature using a tool to meet a need and more like a creature that cannot stop. This is the finding that made Skinner's work consequential far beyond its original scope. Variable reinforcement, the unpredictable delivery of reward, produces behavior that looks, in every meaningful sense, like addiction. The slot machine is more compelling than the vending machine, even though the vending machine gives you what you want every time and the slot machine gives you what you want rarely and randomly. The certainty of the vending machine is pleasant, the uncertainty of the slot machine is consuming, and the reason is not irrationality or weakness. It is the way that reward prediction systems in the brain respond to uncertainty. With escalated attention, with persistent engagement, with the compulsive checking that might, this time, produce the reward. Now look at your phone. When you open Instagram or Twitter or TikTok or any social feed, you do not know what you will find. Maybe something genuinely interesting, something that makes you feel good about a friend, something funny or surprising or meaningful. Maybe nothing worth 30 seconds of your time. The uncertainty is not an accident of how these platforms were designed. It is the design. A feed that always showed you exactly what you expected, in exactly the order you expected it, would be a feed you could close with confidence, because the uncertainty, the thing the brain keeps scanning for, would have been resolved. The feed that might contain something surprising, something socially important, something that requires your immediate attention, is a feed that the brain keeps returning to, because the lever might deliver food this time. Asa Raskin invented the infinite scroll in 2006. He was 25 years old, working on a browser plugin, and he thought he was solving a usability problem. The friction of clicking to load the next page was interrupting the flow of reading, and a page that simply continued as you moved down would make the reading experience smoother. The solution worked extremely well in the narrow sense that it dramatically increased the amount of time people spent on pages that used it. In the years that followed, it was adopted by every major social platform and every major news site. Raskin has since given talks and interviews in which he describes what he built with something that sounds like genuine horror. He has estimated that the infinite scroll costs humanity roughly 200,000 hours of attention per day, and this is a figure for his specific implementation alone, not for the entire category of infinite scroll interfaces that now shape the experience of most people who use the internet. He said, in one widely quoted passage, "We've created a technology that is hijacking our minds. Behind every screen on your phone, there are 1,000 engineers who have worked on this thing to try to make it maximally addicting. 200,000 hours a day. That is the rough cost of a single design decision made by one 25-year-old who is genuinely trying to make reading more pleasant, not malice. A consequence. A consequence that took years to become visible, by which time it was embedded in the infrastructure of the entire industry. The autoplay feature, the mechanism by which the next video, the next episode, the next piece of content begins before you have made a conscious decision to watch it, operates on a related but distinct principle. Its specific contribution to the problem is not variable reinforcement, but the elimination of decision points. The moment between one video ending and the next beginning is the moment in which you might decide to stop. It is the moment of maximum vulnerability for the system, the moment at which it is most likely to lose you to sleep or conversation, or the simple act of putting the phone down. Autoplay eliminates that moment. It transforms the default from stopping to continuing, and it does so precisely by removing the need for a decision. To stop, you must actively do something, reach out, press pause, override the system. To continue, you need only not move. The system is engineered so that the path of least resistance leads always deeper, never toward the door. This design choice has consequences for sleep that are direct and measurable. Studies of Netflix viewing behavior have found that autoplay substantially increases the probability of watching past midnight for users who started watching in the early evening. The phenomenon existed before streaming. The one more chapter pull of a compelling novel has put readers up past their bedtimes for centuries, but the engineering of autoplay has given the phenomenon a mechanical reliability that no author could achieve. The compelling novel requires that the story be compelling enough to hold you. Netflix's autoplay holds you regardless of whether the next episode is compelling, because you have to actively choose not to watch it rather than actively choosing to watch it. Reed Hastings, Netflix's co-founder and former CEO, said in 2017, during an earnings call to investors, "We're competing with sleep and winning." He meant it as a statement of confidence, a sign of how completely Netflix had captured the leisure hours of its users. He was also, in a moment of candor that has since been quoted in many contexts that were not the one he intended, describing his company's relationship to human biology with the precision of an adversary. Your sleep is not a human need that Netflix works around. It is a competitor that Netflix works against. This is not a metaphor. It was stated by the company's founder as a point of competitive pride. The biological mechanism through which this competition is being won deserves more than passing attention, because once you understand it in some detail, the idea that you can simply decide to put your phone down becomes considerably more complicated than it sounds. Your sleep is regulated by two interacting biological systems that your body has been refining for hundreds of millions of years. The first is a pressure system. A chemical called adenosine accumulates in your brain while you're awake, building progressively through the waking hours, creating an increasing biological drive towards sleep. The longer you stay awake, the more adenosine accumulates, and the stronger the pressure towards sleep becomes. Sleep clears this chemical, which is why you wake refreshed and why the drowsiness returns as the day continues. Caffeine works by blocking adenosine receptors. It does not eliminate the adenosine. It only prevents the brain from sensing it, which is why the exhaustion that caffeine suppresses returns with interest when the caffeine clears. The second system is a timing system, your circadian rhythm, which runs on approximately a 24-hour cycle, and which is orchestrated by a small cluster of neurons in the hypothalamus, a region deep in the center of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is your internal clock. It times the release of hormones, including melatonin, the hormone that signals to your body that darkness has arrived and that the physiology of sleep preparation should begin. Melatonin does not cause sleep. It is more like a starting pistol. It initiates the cascade of physiological changes that prepare the body for sleep, including the gradual lowering of core body temperature and the reduction of cortisol. The suprachiasmatic nucleus calibrates itself primarily by light. Specifically, it is sensitive to short-wavelength, high-energy light, what we describe as blue light, because in the environment in which this biological system evolved over millions of years, blue light was a reliable indicator of morning. The sky at dawn is rich in blue wavelengths. The sky at dusk is not. The suprachiasmatic nucleus learned, across evolutionary time, to read the blue content of ambient light as a signal of time of day, and to use this signal to set the body's clock. The screens of smartphones, tablets, and laptops emit light that is very rich in blue wavelengths, not as the result of any decision to disrupt sleep. Though the question of whether manufacturers could have chosen differently and chose not to is worth asking carefully, but because blue-rich light produces displays that appear bright, vivid, and sharp. It looks good. People prefer it in consumer testing. It sells devices. What it does to your biology is tell your suprachiasmatic nucleus that it is morning. The rising melatonin that your body had begun to produce in anticipation of sleep is suppressed. Your internal clock shifts forward, toward wakefulness. Your body does not know that the blue light is coming from a glass rectangle 4 inches from your face, rather than from the sky. It knows only what it has always known. Blue light means the sun has come up and you need to be awake. Research by Charles Teisler at Harvard Medical School and by a number of other sleep scientists has established that exposure to screen light in the 2 hours before bed can delay the onset of sleep by up to 90 minutes. This effect varies between individuals. People differ in their sensitivity to light-induced melatonin suppression, but it is consistent enough across large populations to be taken seriously as a public health concern. And it means that the device you hold in the dark as you are trying to wind down, in what you think of as your period of pre-sleep relaxation, is sending your brain the signal most precisely calculated to prevent sleep from arriving. Apple introduced a screen feature called Night Shift in 2016. Which shifts the display toward warmer, redder wavelengths after sunset, reducing the blue light content. Android introduced a similar feature. Both companies presented these as health-conscious design additions. Both features are opt-in. You have to know they exist and actively enable them. The research that would have motivated these features was well established by 2013, at the latest. The software responses arrived years afterward. I want to be precise about what I am and am not saying here. I am not saying that Apple and Google deliberately chose to damage sleep and then covered it up. I'm saying that the research pointing in one direction, protect the circadian rhythm, reduce blue light, and the commercial incentives pointing in another direction, make the screen look as good as possible to sell more devices, were resolved consistently in favor of the commercial incentives. The features that would have protected sleep arrived late, were optional rather than default, and required the user to know what the problem was in order to implement the solution. This is the direction in which the incentives point. The timeline is the evidence. Now let us talk about the emotional architecture of what these platforms do to you, because the blue light story is only one layer of a system that is considerably more sophisticated than light frequencies. In 2014, Facebook conducted an experiment on approximately 700,000 of its users. The experiment was notable for its simplicity and its implications. Researchers manipulated the news feeds of the selected users. One group saw a feed that contained a higher proportion of emotionally positive content. Another saw a feed weighted toward negative content. The researchers then measured whether this manipulation changed the emotional valence of the subject's own subsequent posts. That is, whether seeing more negative content made people post more negatively, and vice versa. It did. Both effects were statistically significant. Users exposed to more negative content posted more negatively. Users exposed to more positive content posted more positively. Emotional states, the study found, are transmissible through the algorithm without any direct interpersonal contact, without the users even being aware that their feeds had been adjusted. The study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2014. The controversy that followed its publication was substantial. What disturbed people was not only the finding itself, which most users would have found intrusive had they been informed, but the fact that no one had been told it was happening. the 700,000 participants had not consented to being emotionally manipulated for research purposes. Facebook's terms of service, which the company cited as providing sufficient consent, granted the company rights to use user data for research, but no reasonable person reading that clause in ordinary language would have understood it to include deliberate emotional manipulation. Facebook's official response was careful. The company expressed regret about how the study had been communicated to the public and said it was reviewing its internal research practices. It did not make significant changes to the way the algorithm curates emotional content. It did not disclose the finding proactively. It published it in an academic journal and waited to see what happened. What this experiment made concrete, what it demonstrated in controlled conditions, is something that was already structurally true about how the algorithm operates at all times. The algorithm is not neutral. It does not show you a representative sample of the content that exists. It shows you the content most likely to produce the emotional state most likely to keep you engaged, and it has learned through billions of data points accumulated over years that certain emotional states produce more engagement than others. The emotional state that produces the most engagement is not happiness. This is worth saying explicitly. Happy people, it turns out, are relatively comfortable putting their phones down. They have things they want to do. Their nervous systems are not in a state of arousal. They feel settled enough not to need the constant stimulation of new information. Happiness, from the perspective of engagement optimization, is not a commercially useful emotional state. The emotional states that produce the most engagement are anxiety, outrage, and fear of missing out. The person who is worried they are missing something important will check again and again. The person who is angry will keep scrolling to find more evidence for their anger, more expressions of outrage that validate their own, more people who share the feelings that the feed has curated for them. The person who is anxious about politics, about their social standing, about their adequacy relative to the lives the feed is presenting, will keep refreshing, because somewhere in the anxious mind is the belief that the next piece of information will be the piece that resolves the uncertainty. It never is. The anxiety is not a bug in the system. It is the product the system is delivering. Now consider what this means for sleep. The neuroscientist Matthew Walker, in his comprehensive examination of sleep science and its consequences, is clear on this point. Anxiety and sympathetic nervous system activation, the physiological state associated with stress and arousal, are among the primary biological obstacles to sleep onset. The transition from wakefulness to sleep requires your nervous system to shift from sympathetic activation, which is the alert, ready, fight or flight mode, toward parasympathetic activation, which is the rest, digest, and recover mode. This transition cannot be rushed. It cannot be willed. It is a physiological process that requires the nervous system to genuinely settle. A platform that keeps you in a state of low-grade anxiety and social arousal until the moment you put down your phone is a platform that is interfering directly with the physiological transition that sleep requires. Not intentionally. The algorithm does not know what time it is, in your time zone. It does not know that you are lying in bed. It knows only that you are engaged, that you are scrolling, that the metric is moving in the correct direction, and it will continue to optimize for that metric until an external force stops it. The external force most nights is supposed to be you, but by the time you're trying to stop it, you are already tired. Your self-regulatory capacity is already depleted, and the system is running at full strength. Let us talk about specific companies now. Not the abstraction of the attention economy, but specific organizations, specific decisions, specific documents, specific moments in which specific people who knew specific things decided what to do with that knowledge. Frances Haugen is a data scientist who worked at Facebook from 2019 to 2021. When she left the company, she took with her tens of thousands of pages of internal documents, research reports, executive presentations, meeting notes, algorithm audits, and she delivered them to the Wall Street Journal, to the United States Congress, and to regulators in the European Union. The documents became the basis for a series of articles the journal called the Facebook Files, published in September 2021, and for congressional hearings in which Haugen testified in person. The documents revealed a number of things, but I want to focus on one specific finding because it is the most direct evidence we have of a company knowing that its product was causing serious harm to a specific population and making a calculated decision about how to respond. Facebook's internal research conducted by Facebook's own researchers using Facebook's own data, had found that Instagram was associated with significant harm to the mental health of teenage girls. The specific findings included: Instagram made body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teenage girls, who reported having body image concerns. 32% of teenage girls said that when they felt bad about their bodies, Instagram made them feel worse. Teenagers who reported suicidal ideation linked the wish to die to their experience on Instagram at rates that were statistically elevated. The platform's emphasis on visual presentation, photographs, and videos that are filtered and curated to present idealized versions of appearance, lifestyle, and social status created what the internal documents described as a particularly difficult social environment for adolescents whose sense of self was still being formed. These documents had been reviewed by Facebook's executive team. The finding about body image had been presented in an internal slide deck that included the phrase, "We make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls." This slide deck was not published. The finding was not disclosed to regulators. The finding was not disclosed to parents. It was not disclosed to the teenagers whose mental health it described. Facebook made changes to Instagram in the years that followed the internal research. It introduced tools for limiting screen time. It added features allowing users to hide like counts. It said publicly that it cared deeply about the well-being of its users, especially young people. What it did not do was make fundamental changes to the algorithmic logic of Instagram, the logic that rewards engagement-maximizing content, that surfaces the most emotionally activating images, that creates the social comparison dynamic that its own researchers had identified as harmful. The engagement-maximizing logic is the revenue-generating logic, and the revenue-generating logic is the logic of a publicly traded company with shareholders who expect growth. Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress. He said the findings had been taken out of context. He said Facebook was investing in safety. He said the research showed complexity in the relationship between Instagram and teen mental health, and that the full picture was more nuanced than the leaked documents suggested. He may have believed some of this. The documents existed independently of his characterization of them. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, writing in the early 1960s about the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat who had been responsible for the logistics of the Holocaust, coined a phrase that has been applied with varying degrees of appropriateness to many situations since. She called it the banality of evil. What she meant was precise and uncomfortable. Eichmann was not a monster in the psychological sense. He was not driven by sadism or hatred in any obvious way. He was, she argued, a bureaucrat, a man who had fully absorbed the logic of an institution and was executing that logic without asking the questions that would have revealed its moral horror. The horror was not his personal project. It was the product of a system, and he was the system's functionary. I am not comparing Facebook's decisions about teenage mental health to the Holocaust. That comparison would be false and obscene, but Arendt's structural insight, that harm at scale does not require monsters, that it requires only ordinary people doing ordinary jobs within institutional structures that have been built without adequate moral constraints, applies to the attention economy with an uncomfortable precision. No one at Facebook decided to harm teenage girls. Engineers built an engagement algorithm. Product managers optimized for time on platform. Researchers discovered the harm. Executives weighed the findings against the commercial risk of significant product changes. Lawyers reviewed the disclosure implications. The outcome of this chain of ordinary professional decisions was, the harm continued. TikTok is a different case, and the difference is instructive. TikTok is owned by ByteDance, a Chinese company. Its recommendation algorithm is widely regarded as the most sophisticated attention capture system ever deployed in a consumer product available to the general public. The precision with which it builds a model of your interests, in real time, from the signals you provide through your behavior, how long you watch each video, whether you pause and rewind, what kinds of content you share, is remarkable by any previous standard. Most users report that within 15 or 20 minutes of using TikTok for the first time, the algorithm is already serving them content that feels specifically tailored to their interests. The average time from opening the app to encountering a video that captures full attention has been measured at around 2 seconds. This is the product of an enormous quantity of data and machine learning systems that have had years to refine their models. The algorithm does not know you in the way that a friend knows you, but it has learned from the behavior of hundreds of millions of people what kinds of content produce the engagement signals associated with captivation, with the state in which you are not deciding to watch, but simply watching, the state in which time stops being something you measure and becomes something that happens to you. Now, here is the comparison that I think deserves serious consideration, because if it reflects reality, it changes the nature of the conversation significantly. The Chinese version of TikTok is called Douyin. Douyin and TikTok run on similar technology and are operated by the same parent company. But for users under 18, Douyin has features that TikTok does not have. In China, users identified as minors see a version of the app that is limited to 40 minutes of use per day. During the school week, the content they see is weighted toward educational material, science, history, vocational skills. The app shuts down automatically between 10 at night and 6 in the morning. The American version of TikTok does not have time limits for minors. It does not have educational content weighting. It does not have a bedtime shutoff. ByteDance has offered explanations for this difference, primarily pointing to the Chinese government's regulatory requirements, which mandate these features for domestic platforms. This is factually accurate. The Chinese government has imposed restrictions on content and usage time for minors that ByteDance cannot ignore. But this explanation does not answer the question that the comparison raises. If ByteDance believed that unlimited algorithmic engagement with optimized short-form video was genuinely harmless for young users, why did it build a version with protective features? And if it believed those features were beneficial, why did it not apply them in markets where no regulator was requiring it to? The answer that fits the facts most simply is also the answer that the companies involved would prefer not to discuss. ByteDance built the safer product for the children of the regulator it could not afford to ignore, and built the more profitable product for everyone else. This is not unusual corporate behavior. It is how many industries have operated in many contexts across many decades. But in the context of a product that the company's own data shows captures the attention of children for hours per day, the behavior has a specific quality that is worth naming. The most dangerous technology is not the technology that cannot be made safer. It is the technology that can be made safer and has not been, in a specific market, because the cost of safety has not been made mandatory. The 24-hour news cycle is not a law of nature. It is not a feature of reality that has always existed and around which we must organize our information diets. It was invented. It was invented on June 1, 1980, when Ted Turner launched CNN, the cable news network, as the first television channel designed to run news programming continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without the natural endpoint that the broadcast era had always provided. Before CNN, television news had a structure. The major networks broadcast their main news programs in the early evening. The evening news, 30 or 60 minutes, well-produced and authoritative, a clear beginning and a clear end. There was also morning news and some afternoon news, but these were limited resources. News happened at specific times. You received the day's information, and then the news was over and something else was on, and the evening could move toward its close. The 24-hour news cycle destroyed this structure not by malice but by logic. When you have built the infrastructure of continuous news, the studios and the satellite trucks and the anchor chairs and the advertising contracts, that infrastructure must justify itself by filling every hour. And the fundamental problem of the 24-hour news cycle is that significant events do not happen continuously. There are days, weeks, in which nothing of genuine national or international significance occurs. But the infrastructure does not go dark on these days. The anchor chairs are still occupied. The graphics packages are still running. The advertising revenue that funds the operation still needs to be earned. The solution that the industry converged on was urgency. Not the urgency of genuinely urgent events, but the simulation of urgency. The visual and linguistic vocabulary of importance applied to events that might not, under cooler reflection, be particularly important. The breaking news chyron that applies to stories that are neither breaking nor news in any historically meaningful sense. The panel of analysts speculating about what might happen if a thing that has not happened were to happen. The live coverage of an event that is not yet occurring, with anchors filling time by interviewing each other about what might occur, and beneath the urgency, the fear. If it bleeds, it leads is a phrase that predates cable news by decades. It describes the tabloid newspaper's practice of leading with violent or traumatic stories. But the 24-hour news cycle gave it an infrastructure and an intensity that the tabloid era never achieved. When you need to fill all the time, and you have discovered that audiences stay with fear better than they stay with measured analysis, you find fear everywhere. You develop the editorial and aesthetic tools to find it. The ominous music under the graphics. The word crisis applied to situations that are concerning but not critical. The implicit message running under every hour of programming that something important and threatening is unfolding just beyond the edge of what you currently know, and that you should keep watching to find out what it is. Doom scrolling is a term that entered common usage in 2020. It describes the behavior of compulsively consuming negative news content despite awareness that it is producing distress, the specific experience of being unable to stop reading about bad things, even as the reading makes you feel worse. The term's emergence in 2020 was not coincidental. The convergence of a genuine global catastrophe, a period of intense political polarization, widespread social disruption, and a set of algorithmically optimized social platforms that were already primed to amplify anxiety, produced the conditions in which doom scrolling became not just a behavior, but a recognized phenomenon worth naming. But the phenomenon is older than the term. It is the inevitable behavioral outcome of an information environment that has been built across decades to maintain engagement through arousal, and which has learned that the most reliable arousal is fear. The person doom scrolling at midnight is not weak-willed or irrational. They are responding rationally to an environment that has been designed to be impossible to leave, and responding biologically to an emotional state, diffuse, persistent anxiety that the environment has been delivering to them for hours. The pharmaceutical industry arrived at the problem of insomnia, the way pharmaceutical industries tend to arrive at problems, with solutions. Solutions that work, in the narrow sense, and that have significant limitations that may or may not have been foregrounded in the marketing, and solutions whose commercial existence creates a structural incentive for the problem to persist. The global sleep economy, sleep aids, sleep technology, sleep tracking devices, sleep clinics, specially designed mattresses, white noise machines, weighted blankets, melatonin gummies, prescription medications, and the many adjacent products that have gathered around the problem of sleeplessness, was valued at approximately $430 billion globally in 2019. This is a market that did not exist at anywhere near this scale a generation ago. Its growth tracks, with a precision that is uncomfortable to sit with, the growth of smartphone penetration and the expansion of social media into the late evening hours. The problem and the solution are growing together. They are growing together because they are part of the same economic ecosystem. Different companies, different product categories, different industries, but a shared interest in the continuation of the underlying condition. Benzodiazepines were among the most widely prescribed drugs of the 1970s and 1980s. They work by enhancing the effect of a neurotransmitter called GABA, which has an inhibitory effect on neural activity. They slow the brain down in a way that produces sedation and eventually unconsciousness. They are effective at producing sleep in the narrow sense of producing a state of unconsciousness in people who are having difficulty losing consciousness. But the sleep they produce is not the same as natural sleep, the architecture of sleep. The cycling through stages including light NREM sleep, deep slow-wave sleep, and REM sleep is disrupted with particularly significant reductions in the stages most important for memory consolidation and emotional processing. And benzodiazepines produce physical dependence in a substantial proportion of users. When you stop taking them, the insomnia that returns is typically worse than the insomnia that prompted you to start, because the brain has adapted to the presence of the drug and is now dysregulated in its absence. The Z drugs, zolpidem, sold as Ambien in the United States, esopiclone, sold as Lunesta, Zaloplon, and a few others, were developed and marketed as improvements on benzodiazepines, with a better safety profile and lower dependence potential. They work through a related mechanism and share many of benzodiazepines' limitations regarding sleep architecture, and they carry their own distinct risks. Sleepwalking, sleep eating, sleep driving, and the performance of complex behaviors while in a state of impaired consciousness, behaviors the user will not remember in the morning. These effects are listed in the prescribing information. They are less prominently featured in the television advertising. Matthew Walker, who spent his academic career studying sleep and published a book on the subject that became widely read, is characteristically direct in his assessment. The sleep produced by pharmaceutical sleep aids is not natural sleep. It is a crude approximation of the biological state it is intended to produce, missing critical features, and it is being used at scale to manage a problem whose primary cause is environmental rather than biological. The person who cannot sleep because their phone is keeping their nervous system in a state of arousal until midnight is not a person whose body has a medication deficiency. They are a person whose environment has been engineered against their biology, and the medical system is offering them a chemical intervention that addresses the symptom while leaving the engineering intact. The sleep tracking industry presents a different version of the same pattern. Devices that monitor sleep, wearables, phone-based apps, dedicated bedside monitors are sold on the promise of insight. If you can measure your sleep, you can improve your sleep. For some users, in some contexts, this may be true, but researchers have documented a phenomenon they named orthosomnia, a term coined by Dr. Kelly Barron and colleagues and published in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine in 2017. Orthosomnia describes the anxiety about achieving perfect sleep that sleep tracking devices can produce in users who become focused on their sleep data. The person who wakes each morning and immediately examines their sleep score is adding a layer of cognitive arousal, the specific alerting quality of checking a performance metric, to the early morning minutes that the restorative biology of sleep specifically requires not to be disturbed. The person who goes to bed anxious about whether their sleep will be good, and who lies there monitoring their own state to assess whether they are achieving the sleep quality the device requires, is a person who has imported the performance anxiety of waking life into the one domain where performance anxiety is most destructive. The device designed to help you sleep better has, for a meaningful subset of users, made sleep worse by transforming it from a natural biological process into a performance with an audience and a scoring system. The audience is the device. The device is made by a company. The company's revenue depends on continued engagement. The device that consistently told you your sleep was excellent and that you had nothing to worry about would be a device you might, eventually, feel you no longer needed. The device that keeps finding new things to monitor, optimize, and improve is a device you keep on your wrist. The history of how sleep has been valued and structured in Western culture is a history that most people do not know, and it turns out to matter significantly for understanding how we arrived at the present situation, because the present situation is more unusual than it is usually presented as being. Roger Eckerch is a historian at Virginia Tech who spent more than a decade researching the history of sleep as a cultural practice and published his findings in 2005 in a book called At Days Close, Night in Times Past. His most significant finding was this: before the Industrial Revolution and before artificial lighting became widely available, the normal sleep pattern for people in Western Europe was not the single consolidated 8-hour block that we currently take as the standard healthy model. It was 2 separate sleep periods with a period of wakefulness between them. The evidence is abundant and consistent across centuries of historical sources. Eckerch found references to what the sources called the first sleep and the second sleep in medical texts, in court records, in diaries, in letters, in literary works, stretching from the early medieval period through to the early 19th century. People would go to sleep when it grew dark, typically within a few hours of sunset, and sleep for 3 or 4 hours. They would then wake naturally, spend an hour or more in a state of quiet wakefulness, and then sleep again until dawn. The interval between the 2 sleeps was described in various sources as a time for prayer, for reflection, for conversation with a spouse or a neighbor, for sex, for light domestic activity, for simply lying in the dark in a state of relaxed awareness that one chronicler described as particularly suited to creative thought. Eckerch was careful to note that his finding was not a claim that pre-industrial people slept better or were healthier or were in some way superior to modern sleepers. His finding was historical and structural. The expectation of what a night of sleep looks like was completely different. And this difference matters for a specific reason. The modern experience of waking in the middle of the night is almost universally experienced as insomnia, as something wrong, as a failure of the sleep system, as a symptom that may require medical attention. In the pre-industrial world that Eckerch documented, waking in the middle of the night was the normal pattern. It was not insomnia. It was simply the interval between the first and second sleep, available and expected, a known feature of the night's structure. The implications of this for the millions of people who currently lie awake at 3 in the morning believing that their wakefulness is evidence of a disordered biology are considerable. Their wakefulness may be, at least in part, a return to a pre-industrial pattern that was eliminated by the conditions of modernity rather than a symptom of pathology. The specific conditions that eliminated it were industrial. The factory that begins at 6 in the morning cannot accommodate a workforce that sleeps from 9 to midnight, wakes for an hour of quiet reflection, and then sleeps again from 1 to 7. The working day structured by the clock rather than by the sun has no room for segmented sleep, and as the Industrial Revolution restructured the working day, it simultaneously restructured the night, consolidating sleep into a single block that fit the schedule that industry required, rather than the schedule that biology preferred. Thomas Edison accelerated and intensified this transformation with the specific intensity of a man who had convinced himself that his own preferences were universal truths. Edison famously claimed to sleep only 4 or 5 hours per night. He wrote and spoke publicly about sleep as a form of laziness, a bad habit, a waste of productive time that the morally serious person should overcome. He said that sleep is a heritage from our cave days, when it served a survival function that modern civilization had made obsolete. He appears to have been wrong. Biographers and historians who have examined his notebooks and diaries closely have found abundant evidence that Edison napped extensively, catnapping, he called it. in his own notebooks, during the day and the working hours in ways that suggest his 4-hour figure was a performance of productivity mythology rather than an accurate account of his sleep behavior. He was a great inventor and a highly effective self-promoter, and the self he was promoting was the sleepless genius, the man so consumed by the work of civilization that he had eliminated the animal need for rest. He was also the inventor of the electric light bulb and the founder of the electrical utility industry, which meant that his personal philosophy of minimal sleep was also his commercial interest. Every hour of the night that people spent awake using electric light was an hour generating revenue for the companies he had founded. The alignment between Edison's personal myth and Edison's commercial interests is so precise as to make it difficult to assess how much each influenced the other. But the cultural consequence was clear. The most famous inventor of the modern era told Americans that sleeping was for the weak, and then sold them the technology that made sleeping less likely. Before widespread artificial lighting, the average American slept between 9 and 10 hours per night. The introduction of electric lighting was followed by a measurable reduction in this average, and each subsequent technology, the radio, the TV, the home computer, the internet, the smartphone, was followed by further reductions. We are now, by most estimates, sleeping 2 to 3 hours less per night than our great-grandparents did. This represents a chronic sleep restriction, not the dramatic acute sleep deprivation of pulling an all-nighter, but the slower and in some ways more damaging chronic deficit that accumulates quietly and whose consequences are often attributed to other causes. The anthropologist Jeremy Taylor has described the last 150 years as a multi-generational experiment in sleep restriction conducted on entire populations without consent, without ethical review, and without any expectation of return to baseline. Frederick Winslow Taylor, no relation to Jeremy, though the juxtaposition is irresistible, was the American mechanical engineer who founded the discipline of scientific management in the late 19th century. Taylorism proposed to optimize every aspect of the industrial production process through rigorous measurement, time and motion studies, and the elimination of wasted movement. Every second of a worker's time should be accounted for. Every motion should serve production. Idle time was waste, and waste was the enemy of efficiency, and efficiency was the virtue that organized everything else. Taylor's ideas were enormously influential throughout the early 20th century, and not only in factories. The values of Taylorism: the conviction that time is the fundamental resource, that the maximally productive use of every unit of time is the appropriate aspiration, that rest is justifiable only as a precondition for further productivity, permeated the culture of American business and eventually the culture of American life. They were the values that made the phrase "I'll sleep when I'm dead" sound like the philosophy of a serious person rather than the forecast of an exhausted one. The contemporary culture of sleeplessness as status, the Silicon Valley founder who works 20 hours a day, the executive who answers emails at 3 a.m., the ambient cultural message that serious people do not have time to sleep, that sleep is for people who have not yet figured out how to be efficient enough, is a direct descendant of Taylorism. It has been refined through a century of American business culture and amplified, in the current era, by the specific demands of an economy in which the device that connects you to work is the same device that connects you to work, is the same device that connects you to entertainment, is the same device that connects you to news, is the same device that is lying next to your bed, right now. Here's the philosophical question that runs underneath everything we have been building. William James, the great American psychologist and philosopher writing in the 1890s, described voluntary attention as the very root of judgment, character, and will. He was not writing about distraction in the way we use the word now. He was writing about the fundamental capacity to direct your attention to what you choose to attend to hold it there in the face of competing claims, and to return it there when it wanders. He considered this capacity not a personality trait that some people had and others lacked, but a trainable faculty, the training of which was, he thought, the most fundamental form of education a person could receive. The person who has developed this faculty, James argued, is a person who can genuinely think. Their thoughts are their own, in the sense that they have been generated by a mind that is choosing what to attend to rather than a mind that is being pulled from stimulus to stimulus by whatever is most immediately compelling. Their inner life is correspondingly richer and more coherent, not because they are smarter or more sensitive, but because the quality of attention they bring to experience allows them to actually inhabit it rather than skim across its surface. Simone Weil, the French philosopher and Christian mystic who wrote in the 1930s and 1940s, made a related point with characteristic severity. She wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. She was writing about prayer and about intellectual work, but the observation extends. Genuine attention, the kind in which you have genuinely set aside your own agenda and are present to whatever is before you, whether that is a text or a person or your own experience, is rare because it is costly. It requires the suppression of the restless, self-serving movements of the mind that want to evaluate and judge and plan and defend. It requires a kind of stillness that is active rather than passive, a directed openness to what is actually there. If your attention is perpetually owned by something else, not directed by your own considered choices, but captured by a system that profits from its capture, then in what sense is your inner life actually yours? If the thoughts that occupy your mind are the thoughts that the algorithm has selected and promoted, if the concerns that color your evenings are concerns that have been chosen for their engagement potential rather than their relevance to your actual life, if the emotional states that accompany you to bed are the emotional states that the feed has found most effective at keeping users online, what remains of the self that James and Weil were describing? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a philosophical question with genuine difficulty, and the honest answer is not obvious. Human beings have always been shaped by their information environments. The peasant in medieval Europe had a worldview shaped by the church, the village, the cycles of agricultural life, the stories that circulated in oral tradition. The 18th century reader was shaped by the pamphlets and newspapers and coffeehouses of their city. The self has never been formed in isolation from the social and informational structures it inhabits. The fully autonomous self, formed without reference to any external influence, is not a historical reality that we have lost. It is a philosophical fiction that was never more than a useful abstraction. But there is a meaningful difference between an information environment that shapes you and an information environment that is actively in real time, running experiments to determine which emotional states keep you most engaged and then delivering those emotional states to you with increasing precision. The medieval church had views about what people should think and feel. It was not running controlled experiments on 700,000 parishioners to find the optimal emotional lever. The optimization is new. The real-time adaptability is new, and the targeting precision, the ability to build for each individual user, a model of their specific vulnerabilities and interests, and to deliver content specifically calibrated to those vulnerabilities, is genuinely new. Herbert Simon, the Nobel Prize-winning economist and cognitive psychologist, wrote in 1971, "In an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes. What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." Simon was writing about the emerging problem of information overload in an era before the internet. He had identified the structural issue that attention is the scarce resource, and that as information grows, the competition for that scarce resource intensifies, but he had not yet seen the full industrial development of the attention economy. Tim Wu, the Columbia Law professor who wrote a history of the advertising industry called The Attention Merchants, traces this economy back further to the penny press of the 19th century. Newspapers that sold below cost, subsidized by the advertising revenue that the large readership attracted. The innovation of the penny press was the recognition that the product being sold to advertisers was not ink on paper, but the attention of the readers. Human consciousness, delivered in regular, reliable quantities to whoever would pay for access to it. The social media platform is the penny press at scale. The product has always been attention. The technology has changed. The precision has increased. The optimization has deepened, but the fundamental transaction has been the same since the 1830s. Give people something that will hold their attention. Sell that attention to advertisers. Do not think too carefully about what this transaction does to the people whose attention is being sold. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher whose work is dense and often deliberately obscure, but whose central concerns are genuinely relevant here, developed a concept he called Gestell, usually translated as enframing. Enframing is the distinctive way that modern technology reveals the world. It reveals everything as a resource, a standing reserve available for extraction and use. The forest is not a living community of organisms with intrinsic value. It is timber. The river is not a place where things live and change and the world does its complex work. It is a source of hydroelectric power. The patient in the hospital bed is not a person with a singular history and an irreducible inner life. They are a case, a set of statistics, a resource to be processed efficiently. Heidegger was not against technology, and he was not a romantic about nature. He was against the unconscious adoption of technology's implicit way of seeing, which reduces everything, including people, to resources to be optimized. The danger he identified was not that technology would harm us through obvious failures, but that it would subtly restructure the categories through which we understand reality, including the category of the human, without our noticing. That we would gradually come to understand ourselves in terms of resource and optimization, and that the things that resist this framing, love, attention, presence, rest, the irreducible subjectivity of experience, would come to seem unreal or sentimental, because they do not fit the vocabulary that the dominant technology makes available. Your sleep, in the Heideggerian analysis, is not simply a biological process being interfered with by commercial interests. It is a mode of being, one of the few remaining activities that is structurally resistant to the enframing logic of the attention economy, that cannot be optimized for anyone else's benefit, that belongs to you in a way that your waking hours increasingly do not. The sleeping person is not a user, not a daily active user, not an eyeball delivering impressions. They are for those hours entirely outside the system, and the attack on sleep is, in this frame, also an attack on the last large domain in which you are unambiguously the subject rather than the resource. Guy Debord published The Society of the Spectacle in 1967, when the most sophisticated manifestation of what he was describing was a television set in the living room and a billboard on the highway. He argued that the commodity form, the economic logic of capitalism that reduces everything to exchange value, to what something can be sold for, had extended itself in the 20th century from material goods into the domain of experience, representation, and image. Everything that had once been directly lived, he wrote, has receded into a representation. The spectacle is not a collection of images. It is a social relationship between people mediated by images. He was describing, with significant precision, the condition that social media has now brought to full realization. The social relationship between people mediated by images is no longer an alternative available through certain media channels at certain times. For a large and growing portion of human interaction, it is the primary mode. The meal that must be photographed before it is eaten. The view that must be captured before it is seen. The experience that is partly constituted by its anticipated representation. These are not corruptions of some purer mode of being that existed before the internet. They are the contemporary realization of the dynamic that Debord 50 years ago saw as the defining movement of modernity. The infinite scroll is the spectacle-made architecture, an unending stream of images of things happening elsewhere, to other people in a world that is always more vivid and more eventful than the quiet room you are lying in. The person who cannot sleep because they are doom-scrolling is not only suffering from blue light suppression and variable reinforcement and sympathetic nervous system activation, they are suffering from the specific pull of the spectacle, the promise that somewhere in the feed is the image that will make the present moment feel adequate, that will resolve the nagging sense that life is being lived more fully elsewhere by people who have figured out something you have not. It will not be there. The feed is not structured to deliver that resolution. It is structured to deliver the perpetual imminence of it. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist and neurologist who survived 3 years in Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau, and who emerged from that experience with a theory of human motivation that he had begun to develop before his imprisonment and that his imprisonment had tested in conditions of extreme severity. His theory, which he called logotherapy, from the Greek logos, meaning or word, held that the primary human motivation is not pleasure, as Freud had argued, and not power, as Adler had argued, but meaning. The search for significance, for the sense that one's existence matters and that one's actions have value that extends beyond their immediate consequences. Frankl observed, in the camps, that the prisoners who were most likely to survive, not merely physically, but psychologically, retaining their humanity and their will in conditions designed to strip both, were the prisoners who had found or maintained some sense of meaning. The prisoner who had someone waiting for them, something to finish, something to prove, something to contribute. And the prisoners who lost their sense of meaning died more quickly, even in conditions that were physically less severe. His most famous observation was this: a human being can endure almost anyhow if they have a sufficient why. The why, the meaning, was not provided by the camps. It had to be found or created internally, in conditions that were specifically designed to prevent it. The capacity to do this was, Frankl argued, the specifically human capacity, the capacity that could not be stripped away even when everything else had been. The relevance of this to the attention economy is, I think, more than incidental. The attention economy is structured around meaninglessness in a specific way. Meaninglessness is not something it produces intentionally. It is not trying to drain your life of significance. But the scroll is not a meaningful activity in the sense that Frankl meant. It does not produce the sense that what you are doing matters, that you are contributing something, that you are engaged with what is real and important. It produces the simulation of engagement, the feeling of activity without the substance of it, the sense of being informed without the clarity that genuine understanding provides. And the person whose life is not structured by a sufficient why, whose evenings are not organized around work or relationships or practices that carry genuine meaning, is the person most vulnerable to the fill the emptiness function of the feed. Not because they are weak, because the need for meaning is real, and when it is not being met by any genuine source, the brain will accept a simulation. The scroll is a very good simulation for a while. Jean Twenge, the San Diego State University psychologist who has spent years studying generational differences in mental health, published research in 2017, consolidated in a book called iGen, showing consistent correlations across multiple large data sets between the spread of smartphone usage among teenagers and increases in depression, anxiety, loneliness, and sleep disruption. The correlations became visible around 2012, the year when smartphone ownership among American teenagers crossed the 50% threshold. They have strengthened in the years since. The direction of causation is genuinely difficult to establish in this data. People who are depressed or anxious may turn to social media more, as well as social media use contributing to depression and anxiety. The relationship is almost certainly bidirectional, but the patterns are robust, the timing is specific, and the mechanism, an environment that cultivates anxiety, disrupts sleep, and replaces meaningful activity with simulated engagement, is consistent with what Frankel's framework would predict. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most associated with executive function, with the capacity to plan, evaluate long-term consequences, and inhibit impulse, is the last part of the brain to fully mature. Full prefrontal development continues until the mid-20s. Adolescence, which is the period of most rapid brain development after early childhood, is the period in which the prefrontal cortex is being built, calibrated, and refined. The experiences that an adolescent has during this period shape the developing neural architecture in ways that have long-term consequences. The question of what it means to wire an adolescent brain in an environment characterized by constant variable reinforcement, algorithmic anxiety cultivation, social comparison, and chronic sleep disruption is a question that we are in the middle of answering because the experiment began only about 15 years ago and its subjects are only now reaching adulthood. We have some early data. We do not have the full picture, but the early data is not encouraging. The question of what to do with everything we have been discussing is genuinely difficult, and I want to resist the format that makes it seem easy. The format is, here are 10 habits that will change your relationship with technology. Charge your phone outside the bedroom, delete the apps, set a screen time limit, take a 20-minute walk without your phone. You know the list. You have probably read some version of it multiple times. You may have implemented some of it, or tried to, or thought about trying to. The problem with the list is not that it is wrong. Most of the items on it are supported by research, and they are worth doing. The problem is that the list implies a relationship between the problem and the solution that is not accurate. It implies that the problem is behavioral, that you have developed some bad habits around technology, and that the solution is also behavioral, that if you develop better habits, you will solve the problem. This framing locates the problem in you rather than in the system, which is exactly where the system would prefer you to locate it. The researcher B.J. Fogg, who studies behavior design at Stanford, has developed a model of behavior change that is more honest about the terrain. Behavior in his model is a function of 3 components: motivation, ability, and trigger. The behavior occurs when motivation and ability are both sufficient and a trigger is present. To change behavior, you can work on any of these 3 components. You can try to change motivation, understand the harm, decide to change, commit to better habits. You can change ability, make the desired behavior easier or the undesired behavior harder. Or you can modify the triggers, the prompts and cues that initiate the behavior. Most advice about technology and sleep focuses on motivation. It increases your awareness of the harm, strengthens your commitment to change, and expects your renewed determination to override the environmental triggers and the depleted self-regulatory capacity of the late evening. This approach is least likely to work because it asks the most of the component that is most exhausted at the moment it is most needed. The person lying in bed at midnight who knows their phone is making their sleep worse and is trying to decide whether to put it down is a person whose prefrontal cortex has already been working for 16 hours and is not at its most effective. The system is running at full optimization. The will is at its weakest. The more effective approach targets the triggers and the ability, not the person, the environment. The phone charges in the kitchen. Not next to the bed, not in the bedroom, in the kitchen. This single change does more to reduce midnight phone use than any amount of motivation and commitment, because it eliminates the trigger, the phone within arm's reach, and increases the effort required to engage in the undesired behavior. You would have to get out of bed and walk to another room. This is a small friction. It is, for many people in the soft haze of 3 a.m., an insuperable friction. The behavior does not occur not because you overcame it through willpower, but because the environment you arranged did not offer it the conditions it required. The grayscale screen setting, available on both iOS and Android, and buried in the accessibility settings in a way that suggests neither company is particularly eager for you to find it, reduces the visual appeal of the screen by removing color. The brain's reward circuitry responds more strongly to color than to gray. A gray feed is less compelling than a full-color one. The effect is modest but measurable, and it requires no ongoing exercise of willpower. These are individual interventions, and their effectiveness is limited by their individual character. You are being asked to arrange your bedroom and your settings to resist a system that was built by thousands of engineers with billions of dollars in resources and years of optimization. The individual changes help at the margin. They do not change the structure. The structural changes require collective action and political will, which is why it matters that the European Union's Digital Services Act, which came into force in 2024, requires very large platforms to assess and mitigate the systemic risks their designs create, including risks to mental health and physical health. It requires algorithmic transparency that gives regulators the ability to understand what the recommendation system is actually doing. It creates accountability mechanisms that the self-regulatory commitments of the technology industry have never provided. These are imperfect and partial measures. Legislation is always imperfect and partial, but they represent the recognition, in at least one major political jurisdiction, that the individual's inability to simply choose not to be manipulated by a system designed with extraordinary sophistication to manipulate them is not a personal failing. It is a structural condition that requires structural response. What citizens in any political context can demand is transparency, not the right to live outside the attention economy, which would require a withdrawal from digital life that very few people can afford and which would solve the individual problem while leaving the structural conditions intact. But the right to know, what is the algorithm showing me and why? What has the company's own research found about the effects of its design? What does the engagement optimization actually produce in the aggregate, for real people, across the full population of users, including the most vulnerable users, including teenagers, including people who are already suffering from anxiety and depression? The right to know what was in the documents that Frances Haugen carried out of Facebook's offices. The right to know, in real time rather than years later, and only through whistleblowers, what the systems that organize your information environment have found about what those environments are doing to the people living inside them. Tiffany Shlain is an American documentary filmmaker who, about 15 years ago, began a practice she calls Technology Shabbat. The practice is simple. Every week, from Friday evening to Saturday night, no screens, no phone, no laptop, no television. 25 hours of genuine digital absence, drawn from the Jewish Sabbath tradition but practiced by Shlain on explicitly secular grounds, as what she describes as a technology for recovering attention. She has written about the experience in terms that are consistent with what researchers have found about attention recovery. The first few hours are uncomfortable, a low-grade restlessness, the phantom impulse to check a phone that is not there, a mild anxiety about what might be happening that you are not seeing. This is the withdrawal, it passes. The middle of the day, several hours into the absence, has a quality of presence that she describes as qualitatively different from anything available on the other 6 days of the week. Not spiritual presence in any supernatural sense, simply the quality of being genuinely here, attending to the people and things in the room, not partially elsewhere in the feed. The end of the day has a quality she describes as reluctance. Reluctance to return to the ordinary mode of connectivity. This is not a solution to the structural problem of the attention economy. Tiffany Shlain taking a day off from screens does not change the economics of social media, or the engineering of autoplay, or the design choices that ByteDance made for American teenagers versus Chinese ones. But it is a practice, a deliberate, regular, structured practice of recovering the attention system that the other 6 days of the week are systematically depleting. The logic behind it is biological and simple. The muscular system requires rest to recover and grow. A muscle that is never allowed to rest, that is exercised to fatigue and then immediately exercised again, does not become stronger, it breaks down. The attention system functions analogously. The cognitive resources required for focused voluntary attention are not infinite and are not maintained automatically. They require recovery, which requires rest, which requires at minimum periods in which the system is not being pulled by external stimuli. The Shabbat provides 25 hours of that recovery once a week. Most people who practice it report that the quality of their attention on the days following the day of rest is measurably better than on the days preceding it. Not dramatically, not transformatively. They are still people living inside the same information environment on the other days, but measurably. The rest day works. There is something I want to say about this channel and about this video that requires a degree of honesty that is uncomfortable but that seems necessary to the conversation we have been having. This is a YouTube channel. It makes videos that people watch on a platform owned by one of the largest advertising companies in the history of the world. Every view this video receives teaches the algorithm something about what kinds of content people watch, and the algorithm uses that information to make its next recommendation. The subscription button I asked you to press earlier in this video is a mechanism by which you signal to the algorithm that you would like to continue receiving recommendations from this channel, which is a signal the algorithm will use, among many others, to shape what it shows you in the future. There is no version of this channel that exists outside that system. What I think is possible inside that system is something modest and worth attempting. It is possible to make content that is slow enough and honest enough and sufficiently oriented towards something other than the escalation of emotional arousal that watching it is a different experience from the experience the platform is otherwise optimizing for. It is possible to create something that invites thought rather than simply stimulating reaction, that treats the person watching as someone with a genuine inner life rather than a behavior pattern to be optimized. Whether this video achieves that is not something I can assess from my end of it. It is only something you can assess from yours. But the attempt, the deliberate choice to prioritize depth over engagement metrics, duration over click-through rate, genuine usefulness over the kind of emotional activation that keeps people watching, feels worth making, even within a system that does not especially reward it. Perhaps because the alternative is to let the system make the choices, which is precisely what this video has spent an hour arguing against. Let us come back, at the end, to the simplest version of the argument. You are a biological organism that requires sleep. This is not optional. Sleep is not a lifestyle choice or a preference or a feature of personality. It is a biological necessity as fundamental as food and water. And the research on what happens when it is chronically reduced to health, to cognition, to emotional regulation, to immune function, to cardiovascular health, to the risk of neurodegenerative disease, is unambiguous in its direction. Chronic sleep restriction is one of the most significant public health problems in the developed world, and it is a problem whose primary driver is environmental rather than biological. The environment is not neutral. It has been engineered by well-funded organizations pursuing coherent commercial interests to keep you awake longer than your biology requires. The engineering is sophisticated. It exploits biological mechanisms that evolved for entirely different purposes: the reward prediction circuitry, the social vigilance system, the threat detection system, and repurposes them to serve engagement metrics. It delivers emotional states, anxiety, outrage, anticipation that are incompatible with the physiological transition that sleep requires. It removes the natural stopping points and replaces them with autoplay, an infinite scroll, and the structural implication that stopping would be missing something. And it has created, in parallel, a market for solutions to the problem it has generated. The pharmaceutical industry sells sleep. The wellness industry sells sleep. The technology industry sells sleep monitoring. None of these markets has a structural interest in the problem being solved, only in the problem being managed, because the problem being solved eliminates the customer while the problem being managed creates one indefinitely. You are inside all of this. I am inside all of this. The video you are watching is inside all of this. The question is not whether you can step outside it. You cannot, or not fully, not without a withdrawal from digital life that carries its own costs. The question is whether you can see it clearly enough to live inside it with some degree of intentionality, rather than being entirely shaped by it. And the first, most concrete, most immediate expression of that intentionality is this: sleep. Not as an act of rebellion against anything. Not as a political statement, though, if you want to frame it that way. There is philosophical support for the framing. Just as the recognition that your body requires something, that the system you live inside has been built to prevent you from getting it, and that the simple act of putting the device down and letting sleep come is, in a specific and meaningful sense, choosing yourself over the algorithm. Every night in which you sleep, genuinely sleep, 7 or 8 hours of the full restorative biological process, is a night in which your hippocampus consolidates the day's learning. Your prefrontal cortex recovers the self-regulatory capacity that the day depleted. Your amygdala processes the emotional content of your experience rather than carrying it forward unprocessed into the next day, where it will make you more reactive, more anxious, more vulnerable to the emotional manipulation that the feed delivers. Your immune system does maintenance. Your cardiovascular system recovers. Your consciousness does whatever consciousness does in sleep, and it is doing something that the 7 hours of unconsciousness does not capture, something that the research has only begun to map. And every night in which you do not sleep, in which you stay up past the point of tiredness, in which you hand the late hours to the algorithm, in which you arrive at the morning depleted and reactive, is a night in which you have given something to a system that was trying to take it, and that will be better positioned to take it again tomorrow. This is not a dramatic framing. Sleep is not a revolution. No one will know whether you sleep tonight except you, and possibly the wearable device that is tracking it and reporting back to a company whose interests are not identical to yours. But you will know, and in the morning, which will come regardless, the quality of the day will be shaped by what you chose to do with the night. I'm going to stop now, not because there is nothing more to say. There is always more to say, and the algorithm knows this, and the algorithm would prefer that I kept going, because the longer the video, the more watch time, the better the metric. But because the argument has been made, and making it again in different words would be giving you reasons to keep watching rather than reasons to stop. And this video is supposed to be about reasons to stop. The autoplay will cue something when this ends. The algorithm will make its calculation and serve you a recommendation based on what it has learned about your attention this evening. I cannot do anything about that. It is the architecture within which this conversation exists. What I can do is say, as directly as I know how to say it, the most honest conclusion of everything we have covered tonight is the conclusion that seems most counterproductive to say out loud at the end of a video on a platform that measures its success in continued watch time. Stop. Put the phone down. Put the laptop down. Let the screen go dark. Not because the next thing you might watch would not be worth watching. Maybe it would be. Not because you have taken in enough information for one night. I don't know how much is enough for you. And neither does the algorithm, though the algorithm will behave as though it does and will tell you, implicitly, that there is always more worth seeing. Not because you will immediately feel the benefit of stopping, because the first thing you will feel is the restlessness, the pull back toward the feed, the specific discomfort of an attention system that has been running at high stimulation and is not used to the quiet. Stop, because the rest is real, because the biology is real, because the hour belongs to you in a way that it does not belong to any platform or algorithm or company that has built its business on the metric of your continued engagement. The darkness is already there. The quiet is already there. The slow physiological transition towards sleep. The release of the day's accumulated tension. The drop in core body temperature. The rising melatonin. The gradual dissolving of the prefrontal self-monitoring that keeps you performing even when no one is watching is already available to you, waiting on the other side of the decision to stop. You have been awake long enough. The machine will be here in the morning. Sleep now.